Her teacher forced her to play the piano in front of the entire class to humiliate her. Laughter filled the room. They expected her to fail. But as she placed her fingers on the keys, everything changed. Silence fell. Because as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." And Serena? She didn't fight back with anger. She let her talent speak. What happened next left everyone speechless. Watch till the end to see how she turned humiliation into triumph. The early autumn sunlight filtered through the fiery red maple canopy, casting dappled shadows on the marble pathway leading to the gates of St. Helena, one of New York's most prestigious academies. Luxury cars rolled to a stop at the entrance, doors swinging open to reveal students draped in custom-tailored uniforms, stepping out with an air of effortless superiority, as if the world existed solely for their convenience. A Rolls-Royce Phantom glided smoothly to its designated stop. The driver swiftly opened the rear door. Eleanor Whitmore stepped out, her slender frame wrapped in a perfectly fitted Burberry coat, golden hair gleaming under the morning sun. A shimmering Chanel bag dangled carelessly from her wrist, a silent declaration of status. On the other side of the gate, Serena Holloway entered through the pedestrian entrance. No chauffeur, no luxury car. Just a pair of worn-out sneakers, a frayed backpack weighed down with textbooks, and a folder of sheet music with dog-eared corners. She hesitated for a fraction of a second as Eleanor passed by. Two worlds, two paths, two fates. Eleanor's gaze swept over Serena from head to toe before she let out a soft, knowing smirk. Oh, look who it is. Scholarship Holloway. Her voice was sweet, but laced with thorns. Her friends laughed, a delicate ripple of amusement, like pebbles skimming across water. Serena didn't reply. She only tightened her grip on her backpack and kept walking. Words like those were nothing, new to her. But today, there was something heavier in the air, something pressing against her like an invisible handcuff. She quickened her pace, heading toward class. She knew the real challenge was still ahead. The St. Helena music room was spacious and bright, lined with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the lush garden beyond. At the center of the room sat a gleaming Steinway & Sons grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the eager faces of students waiting for the lesson to begin. Mr. Franklin Hawthorne, the music instructor, strode in with the demeanor of a man who never lost control. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly combed, his sharp eyes framed by gold-rimmed glasses. He tapped a single finger against the piano's surface, drawing the room's attention. Today, he announced, voice smooth, yet brimming with unspoken expectation, "We'll have a little test." The air shifted. A brief pause of apprehension, then a wave of murmured excitement. Some students straightened in their seats, eager for the chance to showcase their talent. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, lips curling into a knowing smile. This was her domain. Mr. Hawthorne's gaze swept over the class, slow and deliberate, as if carefully selecting his first performer. Then his eyes settled on one person. Serena. Her breath hitched at the sound of her name. What better way to begin, he mused, than with Holloway? A heavy silence followed. Then whispers, snickers. A quiet ripple of laughter from Eleanor's corner. "Oh, how fair of you, sir." Eleanor's voice was syrupy sweet, but razor sharp. Or does Holloway only listen to music through her headphones? Serena's spine stiffened. She didn't need to look up to know every pair of eyes was on her. Mr. Hawthorne did nothing to stop the taunts. If anything, he folded his arms, lips curving in an almost amused smirk. "Well, Holloway?" His tone carried the illusion of encouragement, but Serena recognized the trap. She inhaled deeply, willing her hands to stay steady. Across the room, Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes glinting with quiet, cruel anticipation. She wanted to see Serena falter, wanted to watch her fail, wanted to witness an unpolished disaster unfold. The room felt stretched, the tension tightening like an overdrawn violin string. Serena could hear the rapid pounding of her own heartbeat. She knew that if she stepped forward, even the smallest mistake would haunt her. But if she refused, she would forever be the scholarship girl who never dared to try. Another breath. Deeper this time. "All right." A murmur rippled through the class. Mr. Hawthorne arched a brow, mildly surprised by her response. Eleanor smirked, resting her chin on her hand, eyes gleaming as if watching the first act of a thrilling play. Serena rose to her feet, moving toward the piano. Each step echoed in the hushed room, reverberating like the prelude to an unseen battle. She placed her fingers on the keys. Everyone waited. She drew in a breath. And then she began to play. The air in the classroom remained taut, stretched thin like a violin string on the verge of snapping. Serena could feel every gaze locked onto her. The anticipation, the disdain, the judgment. She sat before the grand piano, fingers hovering just above the cold, black-and-white keys. Morning light slanted through the glass windows, glinting off the polished wood, reflecting the image of a girl with rigid shoulders and turmoil in her eyes. Behind her, Mr. Hawthorne stood with his arms crossed, his gaze sharp, as if he already knew exactly how this would end. "Well, Holloway, we don't have all day." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room, reverberating off the walls, pulling Serena deeper into an invisible quicksand. From the front row, Eleanor let out a soft chuckle, then leaned forward. Her voice, smooth as silk, carried an unmistakable undercurrent of cruelty. "Mr. Hawthorne, actually, I think Serena should go first." The room fell into silence. Eleanor smiled sweetly, flicking a strand of golden hair over her shoulder, as if she had just come up with the most generous idea. "I've already had so many opportunities to perform. It wouldn't be fair to keep taking the spotlight, would it? Serena deserves her moment to shine." Laughter rippled through Eleanor's group, spreading like small waves lapping at the shore. Serena knew this wasn't kindness. Eleanor wasn't giving her the stage. She was setting her up to fail. She wanted to watch her falter, wanted to see her stumble in front of everyone, wanted this moment to be unforgettable. But not in a good way. Mr. Hawthorne arched, a brow, a glimmer of approval flickering in his eyes. "How generous of you, Eleanor." He turned to Serena. "Well, Holloway, are you ready?" A beat of silence. No, she wasn't ready. She had never been ready for this. But she couldn't say that. Every pair of eyes bore into her. Some students exchanged knowing glances, suppressing grins. Others leaned forward, eager to witness the disaster unfold. They were all waiting for her to break. Serena swallowed hard. Her palms were damp. She could refuse. She could stand up, say she wasn't prepared, that she didn't want to play. But she knew if she did, Eleanor would never let her live it down. They would use it against her for the rest of her time at St. Helena. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to steady her breathing. "I'll play." Eleanor's group laughed again. "Oh? Don't be nervous, Holloway," Eleanor cooed, her voice saccharine and laced with mock concern. We're all so excited to hear you." Serena pulled out the piano bench and sat down. The cushion was soft, but she felt as though she were sitting on ice. She placed her hands on the keys, and then her fingers began to tremble. A tense silence blanketed the classroom. Serena sat before the grand Steinway & Sons piano, fingers hovering just above the cold black and white keys. She could feel the weight of every stair, waiting, judging, doubting. She tried to take a deep breath, but her chest felt tight, as if something heavy was pressing down on it. From the front row, Eleanor lounged back in her seat, her eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. She wanted to see Serena fail. A whisper floated from somewhere behind. "Her. Look at her." Maybe she forgot how to put her hands on the keys. Soft laughter rippled through the room. Serena heard it all. The voices echoed in her mind, mixing with old memories. Her first lessons on the second-hand piano her mother had bought from a thrift store. The late nights she practiced until her fingers ached in their tiny apartment. The hushed whispers of St. Helena students every time she walked past in the hallways. "You don't belong here." The thought slithered into her mind, tightening around her lungs. Her gaze dropped to her hands. Her fingers trembling. She had never felt so out of control before. Laughter rose again. Eleanor rested her chin on her palm, tilting her head with feigned concern. "Holloway, if you're too scared, you can always change your mind," she cooed, her voice sweetly laced with mockery. "No one's forcing you." Serena clenched her fists. She could stand up and walk away. End this right now. But then, through the chaos in her mind, another voice emerged. One that didn't belong to anyone in this room. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. She heard her mother's voice, drifting from the depths of memory. Gray skies, rain tapping against the apartment window, a dim yellow glow from their old kitchen lamp. Serena sat curled. Up at the table, arms wrapped around her knees, head down. Her mother, still in her nurse's uniform, set a steaming mug of hot cocoa in front of her. Her eyes were gentle, but her voice was firm. "Serena, you can't let them decide your worth." Serena said nothing, her hands curling into fists. Her mother crouched beside her, taking her hands in her own. People like them believe money is what makes talent. But that's not the truth. They'll try to tear you down, but you can't let them win. Serena bit her lip. But what if they never see me as more than this? Her voice was small, fragile. Her mother smiled, her gaze full of quiet strength. "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." The words echoed in Serena's mind, a flicker of light in the suffocating dark. The moment of decision, Serena's eyes snapped open. Her breathing steadied. The laughter in the classroom, Eleanor's smirk, Mr. Hawthorne's sharp stare. They were all still there. But now, they no longer had a hold on her. She had two choices. 1, walk away, prove them right. 2, prove them wrong. She inhaled deeply. Her fingers settled gently on the keys. Laughter faded. No one spoke. No one moved. Serena began to play. A single note rang out. At first, it was just a fragile sliver of light piercing through the walls of judgment that had caged Serena for so long. But then, note after note followed, weaving together, stronger, bolder, like waves crashing against a cliffside, shattering the layers of contempt that had surrounded her. The room froze. Eleanor's smile faltered, stiffening in place. Her fingers curled tightly around the hem of her skirt. Her blue eyes widened, stripped of their usual mockery. She couldn't believe what was happening. Serena's music wasn't the clumsy, amateurish keystrokes Eleanor had expected. It wasn't the hesitant, fearful melody they had all been waiting for. It was breathtaking. It was powerful. It was alive. The notes spilling from Serena's fingers weren't just sounds. They carried a story. A story of a girl who had been overlooked for too long, a talent suffocated by prejudice, a fire that had burned quietly, persistently, for years. The once lively classroom, filled with laughter and whispered jeers, now stood in absolute silence. No one dared to laugh. No one could laugh. Each note cut through the air like a blade, slicing through the false confidence that Eleanor had worn so effortlessly. Eleanor had always been the best. She had the best teachers, the finest instruments, an environment carefully crafted to cultivate her talent. And yet, here and now, in front of her, a girl with nothing but an old piano and an unyielding passion had left the entire room in stunned silence. A knot tightened in Eleanor's chest. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her skirt until her knuckles turned white. No. No. This can't be happening. She scanned the room, desperate for someone, anyone, to laugh, to break this spell. But no one did. They were all spellbound by Serena's performance. She had never witnessed something like this before. Real talent. A burning force. Something even Eleanor, St. Helena's so-called piano prodigy, couldn't deny. And that terrified her. At the front of the room, Mr. Hawthorne, who had been watching with the expectation of witnessing a disaster, suddenly stiffened. He leaned forward slightly, his usual cold, detached expression giving way to something else, something almost uncertain. Then, slowly, to quiet astonishment, Serena wasn't just playing, she was commanding the piano. Her fingers moved across the keys as though they were an extension of herself, each movement precise, fluid. Not a single note faltered, not a single hesitation. And for the first time, Mr. Hawthorne realized something he hadn't wanted to accept. She wasn't just a poor scholarship girl with raw, untamed talent. She was an artist. His grip tightened. Around the pen in his hand, Serena Holloway had just shattered every belief he had ever held. But Serena didn't see Eleanor. She didn't see Mr. Hawthorne. She didn't see the judgment in their eyes anymore. There was only the music. She closed her eyes, letting herself surrender to the melody, letting every suppressed emotion flow freely through the keys. Her music wasn't an act of defiance. It wasn't revenge. It was a declaration, a message to everyone who had ever doubted her. I am here. I matter. I don't need your validation, because my music speaks for itself. She had nothing to prove to Eleanor, nothing to prove to Mr. Hawthorne. She only needed to play, and the world would listen. The final note lingered in the air, stretching the moment into something infinite. Then, silence. Absolute, deafening silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Eleanor sat frozen, her lips pressed into a tight line. Mr. Hawthorne stared at Serena, his expression unreadable, darkened by the weight of what he had just witnessed. And the class. There was no denying it anymore. Serena wasn't just someone who knew how to play. She was something greater. And whether they liked it or not, they had all been conquered by her music. The music room remained shrouded in absolute silence. Only Serena's playing continued. bold, raw with emotion, a tidal wave crashing through every last trace of doubt. Each note she struck was an arrow, piercing through the prejudices they had placed upon her. Her melody followed no rigid patterns, no carefully rehearsed compositions from St. Helena's curriculum. It was alive. It had a soul. It carried a story of a girl who had been dismissed, ridiculed, told she would never be enough. A girl who now stood tall, forcing the world to listen. And they were listening. Eleanor could no longer sit still. Each note crashed over her, dragging her into a storm of unease, disorientation, and fear. Serena wasn't just playing. She was commanding the stage, and that stage was supposed to belong to her. No. Eleanor felt the world she had built start to fracture. She had always been the prodigy, the best, the undisputed queen of the music room. No one had ever surpassed her. Yet here, now, Serena Holloway, the scholarship girl she had always dismissed, was doing what Eleanor had never done. How? How could she play like this? How could she silence an entire room? Why? Why did she feel so threatened? Eleanor's fists clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, a sharp sting grounding her in the terrifying reality before her. Because she understood something now, something that shook her to her core. Serena wasn't just good. She was brilliant. And that terrified her. Mr. Hawthorne's reckoning? He, too, stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Serena's every movement. Each note she played shattered the principles he had believed in for years. From the very start of his career, Mr. Hawthorne had believed that talent required the right conditions to flourish, the right background, the right instructors, the right environment. He had always nurtured students like Eleanor, convinced that only those from privilege could reach true greatness. But now, a girl with nothing but relentless passion and sheer determination stood before him, dismantling every outdated belief he had ever held. Impossible. The pen in his hand trembled. He had been prepared to dismiss Serena, to cut her down with a few sharp words, to remind her of her place. But now, he couldn't, because her music was undeniable. Serena's triumph. She didn't need to see their faces to know she had won. She could feel it in the air. The shift, the realization sinking into every student in the room. No one was waiting for her to fail anymore. No one dared to laugh. All that remained was stunned silence. And that was the power of music. She didn't need Eleanor's approval. She didn't need Mr. Hawthorne's recognition. She didn't need validation from anyone in this room. She only needed to play, and her music had spoken for itself. Eleanor's defeat. When the winner becomes the loser. Eleanor's fists tightened around the fabric of her skirt, her entire body rigid with frustration. She had been ready to laugh at Serena, ready to watch her fail. But that hadn't happened. Not only had Serena refused to fall, she had left the entire class speechless. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible, as if even she couldn't believe it. The people around her, the ones who always flattered her, always cheered for her, were no longer looking at her. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt invisible, and that was more terrifying than anything she had ever known. Mr. Hawthorne's struggle. When denial no longer works, he wanted to find a flaw, a single misplaced note, a moment of hesitation, anything to prove that Serena's performance was nothing more than luck. But there was nothing. Her playing was flawless. Every note was alive, filled with depth and emotion, something even the most talented students in this class had yet to master. His throat tightened. He couldn't deny it. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't say that she wasn't talented. But admitting that would mean admitting that he had been wrong, that every lesson he had taught, every judgment he had made, every assumption he had held, had been shattered by a girl he had never even considered worthy, and that was something he wasn't ready to accept. The final note lingered, stretching into the stillness of the room. Serena remained seated, her fingertips resting lightly on the keys. Her eyes fluttered shut, as if she could still feel the echoes of the melody she had just played. For a moment, the world stood still. No more ridicule, no more condescension, no more chains of prejudice and exclusion. There was only her and the music. Then, a single clap broke the silence. At first, just one, a solitary sound from somewhere in the classroom. Then, like a spark igniting dry fields, it spread, and suddenly the room erupted in applause. The same students who had laughed at her mere moments ago now sat wide-eyed, unable to hide their admiration. Some nodded to each other, whispering in hushed awe. Others exchanged stunned glances, still processing what they had just witnessed. She was incredible, someone murmured. I've never heard anyone at St. Helena play with that much emotion. That was perfect. No one mentioned that Serena was a scholarship student anymore. They saw her now for what she truly was, an artist. Eleanor's defeat. Eleanor's face burned. That applause. It was supposed to be for her. She had always been the star of the music class, always the one showered with praise, always the one everyone admired. But now, no one was looking at her. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked onto Serena. Eleanor's fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms, a sharp sting, grounding her in a reality she refused to accept. She wanted to object, wanted to find some excuse, some explanation. But she couldn't, because the truth was undeniable. Serena had won, and Eleanor had lost. She forced herself to stay composed, but her body betrayed her. Her lips trembled slightly, her eyes darkened with resentment. For the first time in her life, she felt threatened. At the front of the room, Mr. Hawthorne remained frozen. The pen in his hand trembled slightly, as if he was still struggling to process what had just unfolded before him. He had prepared cutting remarks, ready to tear Serena down. He had been waiting to remind her, and the entire class, that she didn't belong. But now, he was the one left speechless. His gaze drifted to Serena, the girl he had dismissed without a second thought. She had just proven him wrong, completely, utterly wrong. His eyes flicked to Eleanor, the student he had always believed was the best in his class. But now, all he saw was a girl sitting stiffly in her chair, her expression betraying the turmoil beneath the surface. Discomfort crawled through him. He did not want to admit this, did not want to accept that a girl without the right background, without the elite training, without the privileges of St. Helena's finest students, had just delivered the most breathtaking performance he had ever witnessed in this classroom. But no matter how hard he fought it, he couldn't deny the truth. Serena Holloway had shattered every belief he had once held. Slowly, Serena lifted her hands from the piano. She turned to face the class, meeting the eyes of the very people who had underestimated her, the ones who had mocked her, the ones who had expected her to fail. And now, They were the ones applauding her. The ones who had believed she wasn't good enough now had no choice but to acknowledge that she was. She didn't need to bow before Mr. Hawthorne. She didn't need Eleanor's approval. She had proven herself, and, more importantly, she had done it her way. The applause gradually faded, but the weight of what had happened lingered. The eyes that once looked down on her no longer held scorn. She was no longer just the scholarship student to them. She was something far greater. Eleanor gripped the strap of her bag and turned away, unable to bear another second of this. Mr. Hawthorne inhaled slowly, his lips pressed into a tight line. He said nothing, but the stiffness in his expression betrayed his discomfort. Serena rose from the piano bench, adjusting the strap of her backpack. She didn't need to say a single word. Her music had already spoken for her. Serena rose from the bench, still feeling the lingering warmth of the keys beneath her fingertips. Behind her, the class remained frozen in stunned silence, still caught in the aftershock of what they had just witnessed. Eleanor stared down at her lap, lips pressed so tightly together they had gone pale. Mr. Hawthorne stood motionless at the front of the room, his once cold gaze now laced with something else. Hesitation. He knew he had been wrong, but he said nothing, because at this moment, every eye in the room was on Serena. Then a voice rang out from the doorway. That was extraordinary. The entire class turned. Mrs. Collins, the school's esteemed vocal coach, stood at the entrance, her sharp eyes gleaming with unmistakable admiration. She was a woman in her 40s, her brown hair neatly pulled back, her demeanor calm yet commanding, arms crossed over her chest. She regarded Serena with quiet reverence. "I heard the entire performance," she said. Silence fell once more. Eleanor shifted in her seat, but didn't dare speak. Serena remained still, waiting. Mrs. Collins stepped forward, stopping just in front of her. "I have always believed that true talent is not defined by circumstance," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "And today, you proved that in the clearest way possible." Serena blinked, unsure if she had heard her correctly. "I want you to apply for the school's music scholarship." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Minutes ago, no one had believed Serena was capable of anything. Now, not only had she commanded their respect, she had caught the attention of one of the most influential music instructors at St. Helena. Serena heard it then, the sharp intake of breath from Eleanor. She knew exactly what Eleanor was thinking, because that was the scholarship Eleanor had been vying for. She had always assumed it belonged to her, that it was her right. But now, Mrs. Collins had offered it to Serena. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists, heat rushing to her face. She couldn't believe it. Serena Holloway, the girl she had always dismissed as insignificant, was now standing in the very place she had always thought was hers. She opened her mouth as if to object, but no words came out. Serena turned toward Mr. Hawthorne. She wasn't expecting praise. She wasn't expecting an apology. But no matter how hard he tried to mask it, she saw it. The stiffness in his posture, the slight unease in his eyes. He cleared his throat, fingers unconsciously tightening around the pen in his hand. "The music scholarship is highly selective, Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice lower than usual. Mrs. Collins arched a brow, then let out a soft, knowing laugh. "Then it's a good thing Serena is exceptional." A heavy silence settled over the room. Mr. Hawthorne didn't argue, because he couldn't. Because even he couldn't find a single reason to deny what had just happened. Serena took a deep breath, holding Mrs. Collins's gaze. She could feel Eleanor watching her, could sense the quiet unease among the other students, but for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of it. "I'll think about it," she said calmly. Mrs. Collins nodded, a satisfied smile playing at her lips. Serena glanced around the room. No one was laughing at her anymore. No one whispered about her being the scholarship kid, because now she was no longer invisible. She was Serena Holloway, and her talent had spoken for itself. The air in the classroom still carried the weight of what had just unfolded. Serena stood at the center of the room, back straight, eyes shining, not with pride or arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally found herself. Before her, Mr. Hawthorne stared down at his desk, his expression unreadable. In the front row, Eleanor remained silent. Her friends, the same ones who once eagerly laughed at her every insult, now avoided her gaze. They, too, were still reeling from what they had just witnessed. Serena Holloway, the girl they had all dismissed, had not only stood on equal ground with Eleanor, she had risen above her. Undeniably. Serena could have said something cutting in. This moment. She could have humiliated Eleanor in front of everyone. She could have met Mr. Hawthorne's gaze and asked, "Do you still think I'm not good enough?" But she didn't, because she understood. Bringing others down would not lift her up. She drew in a deep breath. She didn't look at Eleanor with triumph. She didn't seek approval from Mr. Hawthorne. Instead, she looked at the entire class and spoke. Her voice, steady and clear. Hatred cannot drive out hatred. Only the light of understanding and talent can change people's minds. Silence fell over the room once more. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. Serena hadn't mocked her, hadn't humiliated her, hadn't taken satisfaction in proving her wrong, even though she had every reason to. And somehow, that made Eleanor feel even worse. If Serena had laughed in her face, she could have fought back. But she hadn't. Serena had chosen the higher path. Eleanor's grip tightened around the strap of her bag, shame burning through her like wildfire. For the first time in her life, she was no longer the center of everything. For the first time, she felt insignificant. Mr. Hawthorne looked up at Serena, then down at his desk once more. Her words echoed in his mind. Only the light of understanding and talent can change people's minds. For years, he had believed that talent was reserved for those with the right background. He had dismissed students who didn't come from privilege. He had convinced himself that Serena was just a girl who had lucked her way into this school, that she wasn't truly talented. But now, she stood before him, neither arrogant nor seeking validation. And he knew he had been wrong, so very wrong. Mr. Hawthorne parted his lips as if to say something, but then he fell silent because he realized, no words he could offer now would change the truth. He couldn't erase the prejudices he had once held. But maybe he could start seeing things differently. Serena gave a small nod to Mrs. Collins, accepting the music scholarship. But she didn't look at Eleanor with defiance. She didn't meet Mr. Hawthorne's gaze with victory. She simply smiled. And in that moment, she had truly won. Serena stood still for a moment before taking her first step out of the classroom. Her back was straight, her steps light yet unwavering. She didn't need to look back. Behind her, no one stopped her. There were no more whispers, no more mocking, laughter about the scholarship student, because now she was no longer just a name they dismissed. She was Serena Holloway, and they all knew it. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the large windows of the music wing. Soft golden rays spilled onto the marble floor, shimmering like fragments of darkness that had just been shattered. Serena paused for a moment, letting the light wash over her. She didn't need validation anymore. She didn't need Mr. Hawthorne to admit he was wrong. She didn't need Eleanor to bow her head or say a single word, because she had already said everything through her music. What she had done, what she had played, had not only changed the way they saw her, it had changed the way she saw herself. For the first time in her life, Serena felt free. She walked down the hall, the same hall where she had once felt the weight of every whisper, the pressure of every judging glance. But today, everything was different. The students passing her no longer looked at her with disdain. Some stole quiet glances, as if seeing her for the first time. A girl who had once laughed at her hesitated, then finally spoke. "You were incredible." Serena slowed her steps, turning to look at her. There was no mockery in her voice, no pity, just genuine recognition. Serena smiled softly. "Thank you." Two simple words, yet as they left her lips, they felt weightless, like a bird finally released into an endless sky. She pushed open the grand doors of the music hall and stepped outside. The crisp evening air curled around her, brushing through her dark curls. The maple trees lining the courtyard shimmered under the glow of the setting sun, their crimson leaves ablaze, like fire finally set free after being buried for far too long. She stood there for a moment, breathing in, feeling fuller than she ever had before. A door had closed behind her, but another had just opened. A music scholarship, a new future, a path she had never dared to believe she could walk. And now, she was ready. Serena tightened her grip on her backpack, and she kept walking. Have you ever been underestimated just because of where you come from? Serena proved that talent isn't bound by circumstance. If you have passion and refuse to give up, you can make the world listen. Like and subscribe to support those who are fighting to prove themselves. If you believe that talent knows no class or privilege, share this story so more people can see it. Let's spread the message together. Fairness doesn't come from privilege. It comes from talent and perseverance.